Karate friends, welcome to Classics in Color, your weekly dive into some of the ancient world's wackiest facts. I'm Mark Graves, and today we're going to be dipping our toes into the subject of sadomasochism in the ancient world. So this topic is very interesting, but it's also difficult to talk about, and that is for several reasons. One being that as far as I have been able to find, there is no Greek or Latin term for BDSM or for sadism or for masochism or for any of these things. It seems like it's just not something that they talk very much about, and they certainly don't have like dedicated terminology for, so that means it's hard to find examples of this stuff. And even when you do, it may seem kinky from our perspective when I'm reading these passages, but we're not always fully aware of their mindset, of the whole ancient context that these things were happening in. So just because it looks kinky or like masochism to us doesn't necessarily mean that it was for them. And then there's the problem of what even is modern BDSM, right? Because it changes a lot depending on who you ask. For some people, it's very sexual, and for some, it's not sexual at all. It's much more like spiritual. So what I'm gonna do for this video is just show you a bunch of examples of stuff from the ancient world that looks kind of like sadism or masochism, and then leave it up to you to decide which, if any of these, you think really were sadist or masochistic for the people involved in them in the ancient world. So the first thing I want to bring up is the ritual flagellations that happened at Orthia. So this was near Sparta, and the origins of this ritual are very fuzzy. There's a bunch of different conflicting accounts. One of those accounts that I particularly gravitated to was that the Spartans were sacrificing to a statue of Artemis, and they were making their sacrifices, but in the middle of all that, they started arguing, and there was bloodshed. A couple people killed each other. That's a big no-no in ancient Greek sacrifices. You don't shed blood other than the actual sacrificial animal at a sacrifice. So Artemis was very angered by all of this, and she cursed the Spartans, and the Spartans were suffering from disease and all kinds of things, and in order to appease Artemis, they asked an oracle what they should do, and the oracle said that they needed to continue to offer her human blood to this statue that they had offended. So the legend goes that originally they would actually sacrifice humans, so kind of brutal, but over time this evolved into just ritual whippings. So here's a situation where we have a ritual whipping that takes place, it's state sanctioned, it happens on a regular basis, and it is in a sort of spiritual context. So it looks a little like BDSM, but I don't want to like definitively interpret this for you and say I know exactly what's going on here, because I can't interview any of the young men or any of the priests who were involved in the whipping. It's just one of those things that's going to remain suggestive, but mysterious. Similarly, there are a couple of wall paintings that seem to depict some sort of ritual whipping or flagellation. One of them comes from an Etruscan tomb that depicts two men sexually interacting with a woman, and one of them is holding a whip and seems to be beating her. Then the other one comes from the Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii, which we think was a brothel, and in that one there is a woman who's holding a whip, and she seems to be beating another woman who looks to be maybe younger. Now there is some interesting speculation about this second one that I read, and that is that the woman with the whip may be Aphrodite or Venus, because we do have a couple other examples elsewhere of Venus being portrayed with a whip or a rod or something, and that this mural is supposed to depict some sort of initiation ritual where perhaps the madam would dress up as Venus and she would initiate a prostitute who was going to work at this brothel. And that would show that there was a connection in the minds of ancient Romans between Venus and sexual pleasure and masochism and pain and that sort of thing. But again, these are really just two paintings that we have that are kind of blurry, and we don't have any other context or writing about them. So we can't say anything for sure, but they're definitely very suggestive and very interesting. Thankfully, we do have a couple authors, especially in Latin, who don't write about epic and mythic topics as much. They like to write a little more down to earth, a little more raunchy, and even though we have to take everything they say with a grain of salt, because lots of times they're exaggerating, they're writing tongue-in-cheek for humorous effect, they still can give us a bit more of a peek into what was normal life like for everyday Romans, what was having sex like for your average Joe. So one passage that seems to be hinting at something kind of kinky going on comes from Petronius' Satyricon. So there's this one character who's sort of up to no good. He's causing everybody a bunch of problems. And these women have apprehended him and they're going to punish him. But it gets interesting. So let's take a look at what he has to say. Onoithea brought out a leather dildo, covered it with oil, ground pepper, and crushed nettle seeds, and proceeded by degrees to insert it up my rectum. The vicious old woman immediately afterwards sprinkled my thighs with this liquid. She mixed nasturtium juice with southern wood and soaked my private parts with it. Then she took a bunch of green nettles and began to whip gently all the area below my navel. Although the poor old creatures were besotted with wine and sexual desires, they made an attempt at the same route, pursued me as I fled through several streets, and shouted, "Grab the thief!" So I think the key line there is that they are besotted with wine and sexual desires. So they're not just trying to whip his ass because he's a pain. They're actually trying to get something else out of this interaction as well, if you know what I mean. So I think in that one, at least, it's pretty clear that there's something else going on. Next, I want to look at Ovid. Ovid is another classic Roman poet, and he writes about love all the time, and he has a whole collection of poems called the Amores that are about love. And in one of them, he's lamenting the fact that this girl that he's really into is sleeping with someone else, and there's a key detail there that I think is really relevant to our topic. Why must I see so often the sending and getting of notes? Why that your couch has been pressed in every place? Why do I gaze on hair disordered by more than sleep and see the mark of a tooth upon your neck? So that last line there about the mark of a tooth on your neck is really cool, I think. And it doesn't just show up in this one poem. It's not an anomaly. It actually shows up a few different times in Ovid, and occasionally even in other authors, even authors that aren't love poets. It'll just come up randomly, this thing about biting people's necks. I guess it was a thing that Roman men were into. It is always men biting women or giving women hickeys or whatever it is. It seems like they were really into it, and it was just sort of accepted or recognized as a thing. And it was also recognized as something very sexual. As you can see from the context of this poem, he's bringing up a whole list of reasons why he knows that the two of them are having sex and that he's upset about it, right? She's got a bedhead, the couch is all rumpled, all these clues that make it very obvious that they're having sex, and the bite mark is one of them. So this is actually a pretty clear example of a pain thing being associated with sexual pleasure. Thanks so much for checking out this video. I hope you had fun. Maybe you found a few things that you'd like to try. But special thank you as always to subscribers and to Patreon members. I hope to see all of you again next week. Karate.